Hey, welcome to another episode of Just Say It. I'm Matt Patrick. This is Chase Davis, and thanks for joining us here. It is Tuesday. What's the date? It is January 14th when we're recording this, so hopefully this is getting to you in a reasonable time to make sense for that. But we also like to take this time because this podcast is primarily designed for those who attend the Well Church. If you don't attend the Well Church and this blesses you, great. We'd also invite you to be generous with our church if this blesses you and help support the mission that we have here in Boulder by being a generous person with us. But if you do attend the Well Church, we also want to make sure you know about a few things that are coming up really soon, actually. So one is, if you're a guy in our church, we have Men's Advance coming up this Sunday, 7 o'clock at our building. It's a great time of fellowship. I know, Chase, you like coming, and it's a good time of guys sharing on important topics that matter to men. So if you're a guy, hope you can join us there. We also have coming up this Sunday another round of our Dig Group training. So if you're interested in joining, basically that's a Bible study centered around our sermons. If you're interested in joining that, we'd invite you to that. And also, we're excited about this. We launched last week Sunday school here at the Well. So 8 a.m. before church, we are studying the 1689 London Baptist Confession. So if you're available and you want to learn and study some kind of rich theology of our Baptist heritage, we would invite you to come to church a little bit early, 8 a.m., and join us for that. So with all of that out of the way, let's kind of just dive in. Chase, I think you're going to introduce what we're talking about here today, right?
Yeah, so we were kind of thinking about, and if you're a listener to the podcast, feel free to always kind of email us anything you'd like us to talk about. There's tons to talk about in theology and other matters in our world. But today I thought it might be helpful just to kind of have an evergreen episode on, how we got to where we are today. The kind of internet slang people will use is who radicalized you, and I think for some people, if they're new to our church, which we have a lot of new people checking out our church, they may not know some of our background, some of our story. For those who have been here for a long time, and we have many of those as well, it may be helpful kind of biographical information for them to go, hey, like, what happened? How did you go from where you were in 2011 when you planted the Well and end up in 2025 where you're like posting memes about Trump becoming president online and all this kind of stuff. So like what's going on there, and give me some more context to understand who you are. And so it's going to be a bit more biographical. And so we're going to start with Matt. We may bounce back and forth depending on that, but I thought it might be helpful. I mean, Matt and I both were born in the 80s, 1980s, not 1880s. And
we are people from the 1900s.
We are people from the 1900s, as I think your kids say. And so I thought it might be helpful to describe that kind of world that we were born into. And that may paint a helpful picture and contrast how our world is different today. So, Matt, tell us about kind of how you were raised, where you were born, what that world was like.
Yeah, so I'm 41 years old as we sit here today. And so it's funny, I look it up. It's always funny to try to figure out what group you're in. And from what I can tell, I'm within a year to being the oldest group that can be a millennial. What's interesting about being born in that time period is that people my age, specifically kind of right around 40, maybe up to 45, were a generation that was kind of raised without things like the technology that a lot of the technology we have today, but we saw that fast shift really, really quickly. And so it's a kind of interesting, like I remember in my kitchen, we had a TV, which was really rare, but it was a VHF UHF bunny ear. So you had to match like the right kind of thing to make the TV kind of work right. And so pre-cell phone, all that kind of stuff. And so, and like where I was born, I was actually born in Germany, and because my father was in the military previously, and then after that he was a musician, and he toured over there and played over there and did all that there, and then just coming back, being raised predominantly in the Cincinnati area, a little bit in Milwaukee and Green Bay, and so Midwest in general. Classic kind of Midwest upbringing of like sports and this kind of stuff. And it's funny, I think about it now as I look at my son compared to the era in which I grew up, it feels very different. It does seem like it was much simpler. Like you kind of hear that it was simpler times.
Mm.
And so I think it's actually something very fascinating for people, 30 to 45 is this kind of, we have like this, we remember the old ways of these simple times, and now it seems pretty complex, and so growing up, it was that kind of thing. Like I remember we lived in close to a lake, and I don't think I like saw my home for the summer. Like we were kind of outside. We would actually go out and things that I think about that I did as a kid. Like I'm like I don't even think I'd let my kid do that now. We would try to swim the whole entire circumference of the lake by swimming from buoy to buoy and spend the whole entire day doing that. My father lived in Milwaukee. I remember when I think I was 12, 11 or 12, my parents put me on a train from Cincinnati to Chicago by myself. I took an Amtrak train to Chicago.
Yeah.
And I'm like, there's no way I would do that now. And so I think that does speak to something. Whether my parents were doing a good job or not, that is debatable.
Sure.
By letting me ride a train alone. But it does speak to kind of the era I grew up in. It seemed like it was kind of societally was a bit more trusting would be a way I'd put it. It did seem safer.
Okay.
In many ways.
When you think about you were raised, I wouldn't characterize it as a Christian home you were raised in. You went to public school. We interact with public schools today. Maybe tell a little bit about what it was like growing up in public school in the areas you grew up in. Would you say that trust carried over into public schooling then?
Yeah, I mean, I never really, I lived in an interesting area. The only option for a private school was a Catholic school. Mm-hmm. So I went to some Catholic schools for part of my upbringing. So I kind of straddled both worlds. The public schools, the one reason I went to a Catholic school when I lived in Milwaukee was because we lived in the inner city of Milwaukee, and that city was kind of already on a trajectory of downward spiral towards crime. When I lived there, for example, I think it was the car theft capital of the United States. I remember one year my dad's car got stolen twice. And like at the public schools there, you weren't allowed to take books home because they wouldn't return.
Oh, wow.
And things like that. And so my family was like, yeah, we're not putting you in a public school. But when I was in the Cincinnati area, more rural kind of context, technically southeastern Indiana, the public school was kind of what everybody did. There was really no thought of private school other than maybe if you were a Catholic, you maybe went to a Catholic school. I actually didn't even know homeschooling was a thing until I got to high school, and I actually ended up dating a girl who was homeschooled, and I was actually in the church that I got saved in. So like it was very trusting in a sense of the institution of kind of public school. Thought it was probably fine. My schooling was centered. I went to a school that was centered on sports, and so
Sure.
for better for worse, it was fun. I had a great time.
Yeah.
I'm one of those rare people. Like I loved middle school. 8th grade, I peaked, and it was. And then I had a great time playing sports, hang out with my friends, prom, all those normal things. I remember just things like after baseball games, sitting on the tailgate with my buddies. After we played a game and sitting on the tailgate of a truck and just hanging out in a parking lot and just seemed very Americana, I guess, and so my childhood had some interesting things, but all in all, that was a pretty good experience in my relation to the public school system.
Would you say that, a lot of people dump on what they call Christian culture, and maybe Christian culture isn't the best way to describe it, but, I doubt back then in Southeast Indiana, you had like furries or people like that in the school. But do you remember any kind of prayer, any allusions to the Bible? I mean, you weren't a Christian at the time for most of your high school or for part of your high school. Do you remember Christianity having a place at all in that?
Yeah, it was almost like an assumed piece of our reality. And for better or for worse, I don't think the point of this podcast is to get into this, but it was almost like we all assumed we were Christians, even though we weren't. And people would say, what do you mean by that? And we'd be like, well, we're Americans.
Right.
And so we're Christians. That was kind of a rural thing. I know that makes people like twitch and lose their mind.
Right.
I remember having a conversation with my father. I said, what do you think about God? And he said, that's none of your business. I said, well, I think it is. And I was really young. We actually just had a conversation about this. And I remember he told me, well, we're Americans and Therefore, we tend to side with Christianity more. So there was and I think that's actually telling. There's a assumption there that's like, well, even if we're not practicing or we don't do it, we see the morals, we see the values, we see those sorts of things as important for our lives, and we're going to not be centered on that, but we're at least going to respect that, and it's going to be assumed. So I do remember coaches praying with us at football,
Okay.
baseball, that kind of stuff. I remember saying the Pledge of Allegiance every day, those sorts of things. I remember a kid in my school died in a car accident, and there was prayer vigils, and everybody went. And so it was kind of like just more of an assumed thing. I don't remember it being controversial whatsoever, though.
Okay. And then talk to me about, in that rural area, you had different kids coming from different backgrounds, but as far as economics go and kind of like future prospects for like what you wanted to do with your life. I mean, it's hard, and I think it's hard when we look back. Anybody looks back on their high school experience, you're kind of wrapped up in a lot of trying to make friends. If you're a guy trying to find a girl,
Yeah.
all this kind of stuff, and you're developing. But as far as like what you were taught about how to make money and how to succeed economically in America, what were some things that you believed back then?
Man, well, I lived in a very industrial area. There's a Ball Glass was there. There's a power plant. And so in my school, I think most of it was just kind of, most of the people that I knew were they just kind of assumed that they would work a normal job. They'd become like a union, like worker for whatever, electric, or go work at a factory. Not a lot of kids were expected or did go to college out of the school I went to. I mean, people thought I was weird because I was going to go to college out of state. Early on, I didn't know where I was going to go, but ultimately Colorado. People thought I was wild for that because I lived in the kind of town where you stay there. A lot of people stay there. I'll go home. My mom loves to take me to like high school football games. She's like, isn't this great? And she's like, I have your Letterman jacket. And I'm like, I'm not wearing that, Mom. She actually sent it to me. And, and I want to go, and it's wild. I see the same people there, and so there, I think at that time I looked down on that, and the prospect of making something of yourself was something that I really wanted. I felt as though maybe there I'd be constrained a bit, not because it was bad or anything, just I kind of had this vision for much more than a lot of my fellow classmates had. And so there was a breaking out of that. But it was kind of like, yeah, you're going to go get a job, you're going to buy a house, and you're going to get married, and you're going to have kids, and they're going to go to the same high school you went to, and and you're going to, they're going to work at the pool in the summer, or like I did, bale hay. You're going to work these jobs when you're in school, and then, you just repeat, and, it's like rinse and repeat. It was kind of how society was there where I grew up.
Yeah, and was college kind of held out as a way to advantage yourself economically, do you think, back then?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It was definitely like, oh man, if you want to do something, you better go to college.
Okay. Gotcha. And then kind of the last piece would be kind of like the political environment back in the 80s, 90s, because in the 80s we're young kids.
Yeah.
So you don't really some stuff is going on, but mainly in the 90s you start like paying attention a little bit more. But what was it like politically? Were the left and right at each other's throats all the time? As far as you can remember, was it mainly a conservative area? Like, what was that like?
Yeah, it's very conservative. The area that I grew up in, we always joke that the Cincinnati area is different than the rest of the state of Ohio. It's very different. That's why we can't stand Cleveland or the Browns or Columbus is kind of like whatever. I think they have like a soccer team.
Sure.
But so they're kind of whatever. But for me thinking back, and I think it's actually important, if you didn't live in this era, you probably don't know it, but there was kind of this generation of conservative people that were raised on what I would call like Rush Limbaugh, like the political commentator. He had a radio show, nationally syndicated, huge. My dad had it on all the time. It was always on, And so I always joke that my political leanings were formed initially by Rush Limbaugh, by sitting in the car with my dad on long road trips and just listening to nothing but political talk on the radio. And so I presumed that the world was conservative,
Okay.
and that the place I lived was very conservative. It was like I remember, I remember being in school and 9/11 happened. And what was it? Toby Keith
Yes.
wrote like the song, and like
Yes.
everybody in school would play that.
Yeah.
And I like when that happened, I told my family I'm joining the military, and everybody's like, "Yeah, you should do that." And my family kind of talked me off that.
Was that your senior year?
No, I was. What was that? That was 2001. I graduated in 2003.
Okay.
So
Sophomore,
yeah.
probably.
So I was
Okay.
like, I went and met with a recruiter. I
Wow.
was like, I'm gonna go serve my country, and everybody's like, in school was like, all the guys were like,
Yeah.
yeah, we're gonna go over there and get Osama. And it's like we were all like, lots of testosterone, but it was very kind of like country, close to a city, but it was just like everybody kind of assumed that. I remember, when Bill Clinton got elected, everybody was like, what is happening to our world? This is the worst thing that could ever happen. And then when George Bush got in, everybody kind of felt like George W.
Right.
It was kind of like one of us. He felt simple,
Yeah.
all of those sorts of things. And so, but it didn't feel, even though when a Democrat would get elected to a position or something, it didn't feel like it had the weight on us as it does now.
Yeah.
Of a political person being elected. It didn't seem to affect us nearly as much.
Right. Okay, so you leave that context with those kind of preloaded assumptions about the world, how you're formed, how society works, the kind of good of civil religion, how to economically advantage yourself. You move across the country to the middle of nowhere in a mountain town called Gunnison, and you go to college. And so tell me about those kind of 4 years. I mean, we don't want to overhype this collegiate experience that many Americans have,
Yeah.
especially in Boulder. We have many, many college educated people, but the collegiate experience can be very formative. So kind of thinking in those same veins, politically, economically, and religiously, what was it like in college for you?
Yeah. So when I got to college, I'd been a Christian for just a couple years. And, I went out there to pursue becoming a professional skier. That was a community that I was in, which if you hang around that community, you learn that they're pretty wild. And so, but also stepping out there from a political thing, I was immediately met with the reality that it was very different than where I had grown up. And all my professors I had, I remember, I still remember her name. She was invited to my wedding. Her name was Mary Mike Haley, and she was a lesbian. And I was like, I thought I was like, this might be like the first lesbian I've ever met.
Right.
Like, and she was my sociology professor. But here's what I would say. My college experience, like if I pick on her, what was unique about that was I remember most of my classmates were very liberal. And I remember her defending my position for me to the other class about how we needed these multiple sides in the education system to be communicated, and I remember her specifically saying, what he's saying is not hate speech. If we define that as hate speech, then we're going to have a problem with the First Amendment.
Right.
And so I really actually, she was a good friend of mine, and we disagreed on almost everything,
Yeah.
but it had an air of, I still felt very welcome there. I ended up taking over campus ministry, and I became friends with everybody who worked at the college who was like the staff. I had keys to our student union building to run my campus ministries. We ran, at one point, it was the largest free Christian music festival, I believe at one point was like in the country, and we ran it on this small campus, and they just like helped us make it happen.
Wow.
And there was a lot of like, there was pushback, like I got written about in the paper. So I'm just continuing that trend all the way through my life.
Right.
Those sorts of things. But I will say the kind of more liberal leaning tendencies of the culture and society definitely started to rub off on me.
Yeah.
I also started to see that, there's a lot of options for making money, but also it's really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe there's the simple form of what I kind of looked down on my friends back home, that maybe there was something to that.
Right.
That was good.
Yeah.
And that this pursuit of being an entrepreneur or doing something big was maybe a bit of a lie.
Sure.
And so I started seeing those sorts of things.
So with going to Western at that time, you went 2003 to 2007. You finished your last class, I think, in 2009.
We don't have to talk about that. I fought that for a long time.
But you went there. Were you exposed at that point to more kind of left-leaning ideologies, whether it be critical race theory that we hear about today, or do you remember any of that going on at Western State?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was so one of my degrees was in sociology, and so it was mainly there, and it was centered on. I remember we read and studied a lot on the justice system, primarily prisons and how they worked, and that kind of bent, and it was almost like how it was taught was look at how bad kind of America is at this. And I think there's things to critique in there, so don't hear me saying I think that they were totally wrong. But a lot of it was like, I mean, I think I probably could have left a lot of those classes assuming that if you're in prison, you probably just got a raw deal in life and that, the system worked against you based off your skin color, your gender, whatever that might be. And so I think that those things were very prevalent in there. My other degree was in recreation, which is hilarious. And a lot of that was centered on like, how do we expand recreation to people who can't recreate, which I was like, I don't know. Like as a kid, like tying it back, I remember asking questions like, but as a kid, I just recreated. Like I went outside and did stuff.
Right.
And they're like, no, we need to expand it. People don't have stuff. I'm like, I mean, either did I. Like we just went in the woods and ran around.
Right.
Like, well, they don't have woods. I'm like, okay. And so it was always kind of like, there was a lot of inclusive talk. I don't think it was anywhere near where it is today.
Right.
But there was definitely a good amount of that.
Okay. And then was there a point in college at which, you kind of threw off your conservative upbringing, you stopped listening to Rush, and now you're like playing for the other team? Tell me if that happened and what was that like?
Yeah. So yes, the answer is yes. That did happen. I was a liberal for a short stint.
Okay.
But I never threw off Christianity.
Uh-huh.
One, we don't believe that you can.
Sure.
But like I've seen people kind of maybe, go into some weird theology, and I did some of that, and there was a lot of movement, and it was funny because I was so focused on ministry, and the things that were out there, the resources I was trying to grab a hold of. You may remember, I think they're still there. I don't think anybody pays attention to them anymore, and I don't think they should. It was Relevant magazine.
Yeah.
And so I subscribed to that magazine, and I got like a book subscription that they would send me a box of books.
Okay.
And that introduced me to people like Brian McLaren.
Okay.
If you want to look him up, go for it. But he's pretty much an apostate,
Right.
And so I started reading this kind of stuff, and it was the Christian left that I think kind of led me down those roads. And I remember the town that I was in has a big rodeo in Gunnison, and I remember just like I just hated I'm like they're singing like Christian songs and they're like integrating it with America, and I was like, this is all wrong. And I'm like growing my hair long, and I'm like, no, we need to know how we can all work together and be at peace with each other. And I think kind of like that combination of being in a hippie town and then getting kind of some hippie theology kind of thrown at me. And then kind of I would say the tipping point was Obama.
Okay.
Obama, that was like right after college for me, but it was kind of that season. It was moving towards that. That was the first time I ever voted for a Democrat.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So there you have it. I voted for Obama. But like I registered as a Democrat.
Oh, wow. You went all the way.
We hosted a fundraising party at my house and had the county Democrats at my house.
Okay.
I had a cardboard cutout of Barack Obama, but at my birthday recently, I had a cardboard cutout of Trump. So, full circle, I guess.
Yeah.
But, so yes, a lot of that I saw that kind of ultimately kind of lean me a different direction.
Yeah. And so then post-college, kind of like we've done the first chapter of Matt's life, college, this 4-year, kind of intense. I mean, a lot of significant things happen there. You kind of come into your own, you meet your wife, all this stuff. Talk to me about kind of 2008 up until, we're covering a lot of ground, but 2025.
Yeah.
What were some of the big things, either economically, politically, religion, all that kind of stuff? What were some big markers there that moved you away from some of those beliefs you started to pick up on through Relevant Magazine and other sources to where you are now?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of that was I've always been very fascinated by politics in general. So I remember being a little kid during the Bush election, the Bush
HW,
won, HW, and like I actually had a whiteboard and I drew the United States with the electoral map on it, and I stayed up all night filling in like what state and like trying to guess what I thought it was going to be. So
Sure.
I was kind of nerded out on that. So I always paid a lot of attention, and I think that actually served me well because when I look back at Bush 2, right, like I think one of the reasons I went towards like Obama and those guys was I was kind of like, I have some questions about these wars.
Right.
And I'd grown up a little bit, right?
Yeah.
I got smarter. I think some of the education I got in school kind of tainted that a little bit, but I had questions. And so I was like, well, I must go this way now. So that leads me into like the Obama era. But then I'm paying attention there and I'm going, I don't think he's doing what he said he was going to do. And it feels as though he's pitting me against my fellow countrymen.
Right.
That was the feeling that I had, the sense that I got, and why I didn't vote for him again in the next election. And but just I kind of felt very disenchanted with a lot of it, even what the Republicans were bringing to the table. I was like, I don't think I like this guy either.
Sure.
And so that was the first time I had that feeling of I didn't really feel like I had a political home, and it was just kind of a very confusing time in a sense. And so I was like, the church is going to be my home.
Sure.
So diving back into it, getting more historical, and I was like, oh no, this coexist shirt that I have, I owned a coexist shirt and I wore it. I was like, this is garbage.
Yeah.
Like, that's not me saying that other religions cannot exist in this world without all killing each other. So I don't want somebody taking a clip of that and saying that. But what it was, no, we believe that Christ is the only way.
Right.
And that is confrontational in its nature. And so I actually swung pretty hard back over to kind of what I would say is kind of just classic Christianity, historical Christianity. And that guided me instead of, I think maybe for a long time, I looked towards politics to inform kind of how I lived and what I was doing.
Yeah.
And I realized, man, this isn't good. So I started looking more to the church to do that. And I was leading a church. And I was like, oh, this is the mission of the church, is to lead people into what is true, what is good, what is right, what is holy, what is just, all of these things. And the church is the way to do this. And instead of treating it like as a downstream thing from politics.
Yeah. So then focus on 2020 a bit specifically. Would you say that prior to 2020, we could use the word more normie prior to 2020? Like, what was there a significant shift you felt politically, particularly politically, but societally, just broadly, that happened in 2020 where you were like, I've changed a lot since prior to 2020?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I didn't vote for Trump in 2016. I wish I would have. I didn't. I was skeptical, very skeptical. Watched his presidency, plenty of mistakes, but all in all, I was like, that was pretty good.
Right.
And I was kind of looking at it, and then I just the backlash of all of that. So 2020, the vitriol and kind of the hate, being in Boulder, being here, and just seeing how much people didn't like what I thought was good, and really. I didn't even sense a lot of good arguments for it. It was kind of off-putting, and I felt as though we had been trying, even in our church, we've been trying so hard to make a way for anybody of any religious or political persuasion to come into our church, learn and grow. I think there's part of me that still wants that, but there was something in 2020, particularly when COVID happened, that just kind of it kind of broke everybody.
Yeah.
And when I saw people, I just couldn't believe how willingly people just went along with things.
Right.
And how leaderless our world felt, even from people that you and I respected, reaching out to them, and just didn't seem like anybody had a backbone anymore. And it was very confusing time, and it was very disturbing. And I was like, huh. somebody needs to talk. Somebody needs to stand up, and it should be the church and saying what's right and wrong. I just thought it was hilarious that being a former liberal, like we would never trust a pharmaceutical company.
Right.
And all of a sudden I'm like told that like these big corporations are who I'm supposed to trust.
Right.
And I'm like, what is happening here?
Yeah.
And I was like, no, this isn't good. We need the solid ground of what the church has done throughout history. The church has handled pandemics before. We've gone through this stuff before. We can figure this out. And so, no, I'm not going to just be bent into doing whatever I'm told to do for the sake of it without any actual evidence of it.
Right.
You know?
And then particularly for us, I mean, we were in a network that was promoting kind of woke ideology.
Yeah.
And we're going along with that in some ways. So tell me a bit how maybe prior to 2020 and then post 2020, how you think about that conversation specifically, because the woke stuff, I mean, it's kind of a tired trope word at this point, and it's a joke. But I think it's an important chapter to kind of like unpack for people who may not know us. Like when we preach maybe a bit intensely about this stuff, it's coming from a place where almost I feel like we're kind of doing penance for like what I perceive to be 9 years of kind of going along with a lot of stuff that we regret going along with. So tell me about that.
That's very Catholic of you, Chase.
What's that?
The
Penance? I know. Yeah. We don't do penance.
Yeah. Well, we were young men. We were leading a church. We wanted to do the best we could. So I think that's important to set it up. And, you know, you do want to be, we've always wanted to be learners. We wanted to be people who didn't just assume that we knew everything. And so we're like, hey, if this like systemic oppression stuff is happening and all these things are going on, then we should probably listen. And so I remember we spent a year, we made, I don't remember what year it was. I think it was around 2015.
Yeah.
We spent a year before it was cool, right? And we said, hey, you know, everybody's telling us that a diverse church is really important. And I'm like looking at the demographics of Boulder and I'm going, I don't know how one achieves that. Right. And so I was like, well, let's do the best we can. And we said we were going to spend a year studying what does it mean to be a diverse church in our context. And so as a church, we read books and we did stuff and we read everything and we kind of got done with it. And we were just like, yeah, I think we are what we are to be. You know, like people of all races are welcome in our church. Quite frankly, anybody's welcome to come into our church. You know, it's one of the things I hate about that. You know, that we're an open church. I'm like, every church is open,
right?
It's just like, but the gospel doesn't. The scriptures don't necessarily affirm everything you want,
right?
And so we were told to do the reading and do all this stuff, and so we were trying to do all of that. The thing is we actually did it. I think like we actually did it, and some of it was okay. But we started seeing holes in a lot of it, and a lot of what we were being told to read and study and go over, and it just seemed odd to us as leaders of a church, as pastors of a church, and so the question I think you and I have joked about this before is, so what do you do when you do the reading, and you're like, yeah, I still think what I used to think,
right?
You know, like I think that book's wrong. You know, and so I think we were trying to navigate that.
Yeah.
But there's a point when it's like you get told so much, and it's like, no, I've done this. I'm studying. You're working on your PhD now. All these things, and like getting into this all, and being in ministry for almost 2 decades now, and just looking around and kind of going, experiences taught me some things, and just going, no, I'm not going to do that.
Right.
No, like just no. And I think it's important for people in our church to know, like, you know, I remember people during the George Floyd time were like demanding that we wrote a position paper on it, like the week it happened.
Right.
And I remember that was actually a big tipping point for our church when I said, no, we're not going to do that.
Right.
And they're like, why? I'm like, I don't know what happened. And people lost their minds.
Right.
And I was like, no, I mean, we should be slow in some of this stuff,
right,
and understanding. And so I think that was a big point for us as a church, is just kind of going, whether it's COVID or woke ideologies, we kind of just said, we've been studying this for 5 years now.
Right.
And we're done.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Very good. Anything else from your vantage point that you want to share on your story?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I think of it now as, being in my 40s and having a high school age kid and looking back at my own story, and it's going, how do we set up our children for the future? How do we set up this church for the future? You start, when, it is funny. I don't view being in my 40s as being really old or anything, but you do kind of look at things a bit differently. There's not as many opportunities for me. I don't have the opportunity to make a giant mistake in life again.
Right.
It affects more people. But I think of it, how do I have my children thrive in a society that seems to be fairly against them? There's a lot happening in the world right now. I mean, while we're sitting here, there's like Senate confirmation hearings going on right now and around people, and I'm hopeful that some good things will happen in this next presidency. But I've learned over time, and this is what I'm trying to impart to my children, is that our hope is in Christ and our connection to the church. And that doesn't mean we don't interact with politics. Actually, it's just that's kind of our starting point. And out of that, I want them to kind of build their own kind of theology of politics, family, the world, all of these things, and then live those things out into the world, whether that bothers people or not.
Yeah.
So
That makes sense.
yeah.
Good. Well, we could end the episode there if we wanted to end on Matt. Do you want me to tell?
Yeah, like let's do it. Well, why don't we go with you? I mean, because I think it's important for people to know a little bit, and I talk way more than you, so I apologize. But why don't we, like, because I think it's important if we just let's do this. Let's go. You in Dallas.
Yep.
Very different world.
Yep.
Than what I grew up in.
Yeah.
But also very similar in many respects. Take that and then transfer that to go there. Go 2008.
Mm-hmm.
With the kind of the markets crashing, and then jump to like your 2020.
Yeah. So the world I grew up in, pre-internet. I remember I sent my first email back in 1994, I believe. AOL, dial-up, that lovely sound that brings back so many memories. But yeah, I was raised in a conservative Christian home, went to private Christian schooling, grew up in the church. The church was a big church. When we went there, it wasn't as big as it became. But I was baptized there. I went to like Mother's Day Out and Awanas and like just the whole Christian experience. And as a young person, a child, like you don't really know what to be grateful for because you don't really see things differently. I went on a couple mission trips in high school, and that kind of opened my eyes to like poverty because I grew up very affluent in North Dallas. And we could get on a whole topic of mission trips. That would actually be a good episode for Just Say It. But for me, it was really formational, and it sparked an interest in me of like, oh, wow, like there's a lot more going on in the world. And our school and our church would do ministry to the homeless in inner city Dallas. We would go down there and give out lunches and that kind of thing. We would go like minister at halfway houses and that kind of thing. So we're always kind of doing that stuff. We were active in the community. But in high school, 2001 happened. And at that point, I think I got my first cell phone, the Nokia where you could play Snake. What was your first cell phone? I know you had beepers at one point.
I did have beepers. Yes. That's a whole other podcast.
Did you have a Razor? What did you have when you had a cell phone?
Yeah, I had a Razor.
That's funny. You would. You're a cool guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a Nokia, and you could text and call. But 2001 happened, and it was similar for many of my friends. Like I was a big Bush W guy. I had the sticker on my truck. And so I was always generally conservative. My family's from East Texas. I didn't know any Democrats. I didn't know definitely any lesbians. So it was just like not part of, how I was raised. And going to Prestonwood, I try to speak really positively of them because that's where God saved me. But it was very dispensational and Arminian. Mm-hmm. Dallas was very formed by Dallas Theological Seminary. A lot of my teachers in high school had affiliations with Dallas Theological Seminary. And so that's the kind of perspective on politics we would get, and eschatology, like I think it was Tim LaHaye wrote Left Behind.
Yep.
And so Left Behind, I read that. I think it was middle school, high school.
Were you terrified?
Yeah, but it was kind of like as a guy, you get terrified of the end of the world. It's kind of like an apocalyptic, like, oh man, what are we going to do?
Yeah.
We would sing songs in choir at the Christian school, like, I wish we'd all been ready. And so it was very dispy. So the hope for the world was more like it's all going to burn,
Yeah.
I grew up coming to Colorado, And so I'd always loved this place, as most Texans do. Most people in the United States have a great desire to be here. It's a beautiful place. And so went to Texas A&M, felt like a sense of duty going there because my granddad graduated there in 1938, and then my mom went there. And so I went there and met my wife. And in college, leaving high school, I had kind of become disenchanted with what I perceived to be kind of a marriage of like the religious right. I'd grown up in kind of a religious right culture. I didn't know who Jerry Falwell was, but like I just kind of knew that's what our church did. Every like political holiday, we would celebrate America, that kind of thing. I never viewed that as like necessarily inherently bad to be patriotic, but I viewed it as odd, and nobody could really explain to me like what was going on, like kind of the assumptions behind why we're doing that. Like, why are we putting a big American flag, and why are we not singing songs to Jesus on a Sunday morning? Why are we singing songs to America? This seems odd to me as a young person. So I go to college and I start just exploring other kind of like ways of Christianity. I'd been overseas a little bit and I wanted to know more. And so I just picked up books at Barnes and Noble that seemed like provocative, like, you know, Jesus for President or Irresistible Revolution by Shane Claiborne. And I really got into that kind of red letter Christianity without knowing it. It's not like it sought me out. Kind of like you got these books and then you started reading them and you're like, oh, wow, these are really different. They seem innovative. I think I had grown up thinking we can all just get along. Politics wasn't as vicious as it seems now, although politics is always vicious. It was just like hidden back then. And so I wrote in Jesus for President at one point, and I think I voted in 2008 for the first time, Jesus for President. So I didn't vote for Obama for sure, but I also felt the similar thing with you. It's like I don't really like either of these options. And I, like you, grew my hair out, met my wife, and I had ministry aspirations, felt called to ministry. Really, I wanted to go to seminary because I had a lot of questions that didn't really seem to be easily answered. Like I was never taught about, I never read anything by Luther or Calvin or anything growing up. You know, it was very like kind of pop level Christianity, and it was very pietistic, focused on personal holiness and killing your sin, but they would never refer to it as killing your sin. It would just be like accountability groups. Went to Christian summer camp, also patriotic, very sports oriented. But economically, I'd always been told like you can be whatever you want to be. If you go to college, for me in our culture, it was like going away to college was actually something lauded. So like they would always celebrate the people that like, look, this person got into Harvard, this person, and they're going here at this small liberal arts school, and everybody was like, wow, that's amazing. Most people went to like Baylor, A&M, or Texas, or OU. We had some people go to OU, but college was a place to become economic. Like that's what you had to do. Like I think only one person from my graduating class did not go to college. And so it's just assumed if you go to college, you get a good job and you'll kind of live a good life. And Christianity was definitely the assumed norm worldview of that time. 2008 hits, the market crashes right when I graduate. And I'd kind of adopted a lot of whack theology from like David Platt's Radical about money. And so even money became something that I was like bitter about, which is really stupid. But looking back, you know, trying to develop some sympathy for myself, like the situation was like the market had crashed. I had been fed a lot of theology that was like, you know, give up all your worldly possessions. You know, if you're holding on to money, that means you're greedy. And so I didn't really put a lot of effort into like trying to get a good career job. I was like going to job fairs and like trying to get a job because I wanted to provide for my wife, but it wasn't like I was like, I'm going to do this, 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 this. I never really had a clean cut plan for like how I'm going to like achieve or climb a ladder anywhere. Where a lot of people do. Moved to Colorado. I was content kind of being a raft guide when we moved here, but God provided a much better job than that. Went to your church and met you kind of at the tail end of that journey. And there's all sorts of other stories we can get into about that. But you were kind of coming out of like, I guess, just voting for Obama when I met you a year and a half before, I guess 9 months before, because May 2009 is when I moved to Colorado, June 2009, right around there. And we just hit it off. You were kind of a Mark Driscoll variety, and I was more of a Matt Chandler variety Christian.
Yeah, Driscoll was actually, I know, like people like to hate on him or love him, whatever.
Right.
But I do owe him in a sense that, like, in my liberal phase, Actually, it's like somebody sent me a Driscoll sermon, and I'm like, what is this? And it
Right.
led me to other good teachers and things. And so, yeah, that was an interesting time.
Yeah, so I remember seeing like we didn't have any in Colorado or in College Station. We didn't have any like the protests like the Wall Street. I can't remember what it was called. Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah.
We never had any of that, but like I remember having a degree of sympathy, even though I view them as kind of dumb, out in their drum circles in Central Park. I was like, this is stupid. At the same time, you kind of developed a sense of like, what if economically things aren't as good as I've been told? Even though I've been very blessed, like I've been to other countries. I've seen poverty. We have poverty in the United States, and so what might be true there that they're getting at. And I think from 2009 when I moved to Colorado to like 2020, I was trying to like think like a missionary. I was trying to like, okay, this isn't the Bible Belt. Colorado's not the Bible Belt. So how do we minister to people here, understand where they're coming from? In Gunnison, we didn't really have a lot of like liberal ideology at the church as far as I perceived. It was a lot of rural, conservative Christian guys, especially on the elder team. And then when we moved to Boulder, I think there was a lot of like desire to minister in the city, for the city kind of stuff. I was listening to a lot of Keller, trying to figure out, okay, if this city's primarily liberal, then how can we articulate the gospel to liberals?
Yeah.
And that was what was occupying a lot of my mind. And so I think I've said this before in other places, but I remember when we moved here, I was like, so what does it mean to contextualize the gospel here? Do I need to drive a Prius, wear a scarf, drink tea, go to the Trident Cafe and make friends? And I kind of had a breaking point. I remember talking about it with you. I was like, that just seems really disingenuous. Like it feels like fake. That's not who I am. It's not what I'm about. It's not how I was raised. You would be a try-hard. There may be a place for that going overseas, I guess, but this is America. Like it's Boulder, but it's still America.
Yeah.
And we were trying to do, like you said, kind of the woke stuff, light, just trying to understand. Like I wrote an article back in 2014, I believe it was, after I think it was Trayvon or somebody, one of the big stories. They happened to come up in Obama. Those were really front loaded into the media as far as like this is the story of America. And so back then I was trying to develop a lot of sympathy, and I didn't vote, like you said. I didn't vote for Trump in 2016. Wish I had. My mom scolded me for not voting for Trump. I voted for Evan McMuffin, and obviously that worked out. But I was always generally conservative, and going to seminary actually like whipped me into shape. Woke me out of a lot of like lib sympathies that I developed that were unhealthy, that were really a problem, particularly around the issue of abortion. Because in Boulder, we have one of the most abortion-friendly towns in America and the world. And I thought that muting our convictions on that would be missionally advantageous. And I just came to the point early on at the well. You were always more courageous on that particular matter earlier than me. But I remember being like, we can't shrink back on this, even for the sake of the gospel to reach the lost. Like that's not advantageous to us.
Well, do you think, maybe answer this, did you feel that like a tension in your soul as like you were kind of like navigating these kind of like woke things, but being raised how you were, was there something in the back of your head, you might even say the Holy Spirit,
right,
kind of going, hey, this isn't for you?
Yeah, I think for me it was like eventually it came to the point of what are they saying about my family, and what are they saying about the people who founded this country, and being also my family, because our family has been in America for 400 years at this point. And so are they asking me to disavow my own family? And is my family all wrong on this matter? And for a while I was able to hold that idea without condemning them. But then 2020 hit, and that's when it like punched me in the face. When I saw a bunch of evangelical leaders, like you said, bending over backwards, doing whatever the government says, and yet at the same time giving permission for people to march in the streets about this matter. and like seeing the cities burn down and the media cover that up and lie about it, and seeing the media lie and lie and lie about all sorts of stuff. And then you start, like, I got really into like the whole like Russiagate stuff. Not that I believed it, but I was like, this seems all really weird. And when you start looking at like how they try to like take out Trump in his first term and how they undermined him, I was like, holy cow. I thought these like ABC, PBS, like I used to listen to NPR because I thought it was like, neutral. And you start realizing, no, it's not. Like it's like the proletariat broadcasting system. It's government funded, and all these institutions are aligned to promote a narrative. And what is that narrative? And in 2020, I did a deep dive. I did the reading, like you were saying, and I remember listening to Eric Mason, and he recommended a bunch of books, and I spent like $100 on all the books he recommended. And I was reading them. I was like, this is all just like neo-Marxism. It's commie stuff. Like this is not biblical. Their understanding of justice is not biblical justice. Their understanding of how we understand how the world works economically is dumb. It's not creation oriented. It's socialistic. And at that point, I had a choice to make. I was like, well, if this is where I've come to, and this is what I believe, either I have to leave because we've built a church based on some teachings that I now would not hold to, or we have to do some hard work here. And we chose to do the hard work here.
Yeah. What would you say? Because, I mean, that didn't come without loss.
Right.
Those choices.
Right.
Our church was bigger then, right? And it's smaller now, and it's growing again, which is great. And praise God for that. But what would you say, like, why is it important in your mind? I know I have my thoughts, but I want to hear from you. Why is it important for us to talk about this stuff? Like, we're doing this podcast right now. We do Men's Advanced. We do Theology on Tap. And we don't shoehorn stuff into our sermons. We generally preach through the Bible. But if the opportunity's there and it deals with something that is big in culture, we're going to teach on it.
Yeah.
So why is it important that we keep doing that, even though if you go from a pragmatic standpoint, it's not advantageous necessarily for us to do that?
Right. I think it comes from a deep conviction I have personally about like why I'm in ministry in the first place. Like I didn't get in ministry because it's like, this is a great career where I can make lots of money. Like that wasn't like the reason. And why I chose to go into seminary and study was because I wanted to love God and honor God with my life. And if as a minister I fail to uphold the full counsel of God and speak to the most pressing matters of the day, I view myself as a coward. That doesn't mean there's not prudence and wisdom involved in how you communicate those things or when to communicate those things. But to me, it's like, why would I be doing this job if I shrink back in the heat of battle? And I started realizing that a lot of the people in our church we think it's tough for us. And you make a lot of good jokes about how ministers are typically pretty lazy and they have cush jobs. Yeah. But if we think it's tough for us, think about the people that are in the pews, that are in the secular workplace every day being fed this stuff, being told that men can become women, women can become men, being told that firing a bunch of white people because they're white and replacing them with other people, and that's good. And they're being lectured day in and day out. They're being told, put pronouns in your bio to be a loving person. What is that like? And I developed a great deal of sympathy for that, for the people that are facing that in the workplace, how to navigate that well. Mm-hmm. And prior to 2020, I did feel like I was constantly walking on eggshells in the church because we had planted a church in a liberal context, which attracted a lot of both conservatives and liberals. And I used to hold it as kind of a good thing that nobody knew if we were liberal or conservative. And I just started giving up on that. Like, I still do. I want to be a place where people can ask their hardest questions, honest questions. We had always been about that. We had always been about being truthful about God's world and how he made it in God's word. And so when 2020 hit and I started just posting online about like, here's what I think about COVID. And I got some of the nastiest emails I've ever received in my life. And I was like, this is surprising. I thought we had created a culture where we could have these conversations. That's what we had tried to do when we started the Well. Mm-hmm. We wanted to be able to talk about atheism and evolution and all this kind of stuff from a biblical perspective. And all of a sudden, I say an article about how you should have hope in the face of death. And you're calling me an apostate in an email and saying I'm an embarrassment to the church. And I'm like, yeah, I'm done.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do for you. Like, I'm sorry you feel that way, I guess.
Yeah.
But like, I can't do this. So I think now I don't feel that way at all at the well. I feel I've never been happier in terms of how we get to minister to one another, and who we're reaching and how we're proclaiming God's word. And we're like you said, we're always trying to grow, mature in that. But at the same time, we're not afraid to have fun. That's one thing that you're really good at, and you've taught me a lot about, is how to have fun and how to, like, part of that means growing, learning, and asking for forgiveness and receiving mercy. And so I think when I think back of 2011 to 2020, it felt like I was in like a mind trap of like being constrained by all these outside voices and forces of like what a minister's supposed to be, what the church should do, all this kind of stuff. And now I'm just kind of like, yeah, like I'm not living that way anymore. And I think it's a lot more freeing and fun. I really don't care if they call me bad words or what they perceive to be bad words, whether it's racist, misogynist, pro-birther, leader of the Christian Taliban, whatever. Like, like,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah, we've been called everything now.
yeah. So like, I just, those magic words have no power over me anymore.
Yeah.
And that's super freeing, and it's more fun, and it helps to equip the body of Christ to be more courageous. And I think the word missional became such a junk drawer term to justify a lot of liberal ideology in the church regarding economics, politics, race, whatever it may be. And so, yeah, we are missional in a sense of like, we want to see more people know Jesus in this town, but not in the same way we were. Missional became kind of a coping word for cowardice in my mind, where you just avoided certain topics in hopes that a lost person would darken the door of the church. And I think our target idea of who we wanted to be saved, like, we want all people to be saved, but I think for a lot of ministers and a lot of Christians, they think of like the worst, like the person who's most seems furthest from God, whether it's the vehement atheist professor or the tranny working at the coffee shop or whatever it may be. They think that's like, we got to make sure all of our language is couched to be non-offensive to that person. And I was like, I can't do that anymore. Like, when I saw the left was animated by wanting to kill babies and wanting to mutilate people in their sexuality, and that's like an animating principle for them, is destruction and death. I was like, I'm just not. I mean, like, they can repent. Like, I can preach the gospel to them, but I'm not going to like shift my message and pull punches for people that want to murder people. Like, that's just not what I'm going to do.
I remember when the choir did the thing about "We're coming for your kids."
Yeah.
The gay and lesbian or whatever choir.
Yeah.
And they did that thing. I was like, oh,
Right.
they're not even hiding it anymore.
No.
And so, like, I think those things, and just one thing to add, and we should probably wrap up here in a moment, but is, for me, I think it became very apparent that our people are consuming a lot of stuff.
Yes.
And if we don't speak on this and say, this is why this is bad, this is why this book is wrong,
Right.
Here's a better book, these sorts of things. This podcast, because what we were getting was kind of the big evangelical world pastors, especially during COVID. People were just consuming even more their sermons because they weren't going to church,
Right.
and things. And I'm like, wow, my people are being formed by somebody other than their local pastor.
Right.
And I don't think this is good.
Right.
There's good things you can consume and be formed by, but that's our job.
Right.
And so we need to do our job.
Yeah, for sure.
And so when people are like, man, do you have to say? I'm like, well, I have to do my job.
Yeah.
If you don't do your job, you get fired.
Yeah.
I may not necessarily get fired from this job, but when I read scripture, the role that I have, there is a big responsibility there, and God is going to be the final arbitrator. Like, he's going to determine whether we did a good job or not.
Yeah, and I think we saw a lot of people consuming, and that was our responsibility as well. Like, I promoted Russell Moore a lot and Tim Keller and all this stuff, and then you saw what they actually said online on Twitter and other places about social matters, economics, race, all this kind of stuff, and you're like, oh no, like, I disagree with this, and now my people are following them because I recommended them. I've made a huge mistake. And so I view it as part of my responsibility to, as a defender of the faith, to represent the faith and to speak clearly. Of course, many people don't know who Russell Moore is. Tim Keller, they may not know who he is, but a lot of that is like, how do we, if our people like are listening to Be the Bridge, or they're listening to, there's this YouTube channel. I think it was Hard Conversations with a Black Man or Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man, and that was really popular, particularly among white women. They really enjoyed that, to see Chip and Joanna Gaines on there. And I realized,
Shiplap everywhere.
yeah, and I was like, this is bad stuff, guys. These are communist struggle sessions that they're trying to, like, when I saw the CEO of Chick-fil-A like performatively wash a black man's feet because he was black, I'm like, bro, like, this is all real bad. And I wanted to help people, and I still do want to help people kind of wake up to, like, I think some people are ready to go, it seems bad out there. And I'm like, it's much worse than you think it is. It's much worse than you think it is. My hope is not in Donald Trump. I'm hopeful that when he's inaugurated that we'll see good things happen. At the same time, like, the left has such institutional power in this country in terms of media, education, politics, HR departments, whatever you name it. And so I speak out on that stuff from a biblical perspective, and we want to speak out on that stuff on this podcast and other places because we want to reinvigorate Christians to live a holy life before the Lord. And if they're consuming that media, if they're following these accounts on Instagram, listening to these podcasts, still trying to do that playbook of like, well, I'm going to listen to both sides so I can get the best arguments on both sides. It's like, I really view that as a waste of time. I don't view that as a good productive use of your time. You can do that, but I gave up that project because I realized, wow, this is like really bad stuff. Like, growing up, I think what rattled me, man, was like growing up, the idea of a man becoming a woman and parading themselves in public and seeking out children to twist into their perversion. Like, my granddad would have like gone and like ended that yesterday, you know, and like that was a joke growing up in the 90s. And now we're expected to just kind of be like, oh, this is just freedom of expression and it's a blessing of liberty. I'm like, well, then forget that. Like, I don't want to be part. I'm not part of your social experiment. I don't want to be part of this communist revolution. And I'm an American. I'm also a pastor and a minister. I'm a father. I'm a husband. And I want to fulfill my duties to my country, to my family, and to my church. And that means I'm going to speak out more.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when we pulled our kids out of public school and we were talking to one of the teachers, and they said, why are you doing this? And I said, I feel like everything that you're doing in the school system is just an experiment on my kids.
Yeah.
And my kids are not here for your experiment.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's what we need to, I think that's a good way to kind of wrap this up, is what we see is that the church needs to become awakened to the reality that we have all that we need through scripture, through church history, through all these things, and that, you know, what radicalized us in a sense was coming awake to that, and that seeing like a lot of these experiments, if you will, economically, socially, so on and so forth, that we need to look at those a lot with a lot more hesitation instead of just welcoming them into our homes, into our church, and going, does this pass the sniff test of what God says is good and right?
Right.
And if it doesn't, we need to get rid of it.
Yep.
And that's where we're at today.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, I hope this conversation was helpful.
It was fun.
Okay, great. If you enjoyed this episode, give it a great rating on iTunes, or I guess people don't use iTunes, podcast, Spotify. Yeah, Spotify.
Yeah, like my kids, if I said iTunes, they'd be like,
What old man? Yeah, I remember the iPods with like the circle on it.
Yeah, I still have one.
Do you? That's amazing.
I still have my iPhone 1.
Oh my gosh, you psycho.
It's going to be worth something big someday.
Yeah, it will be. Subscribe, smash the like button, all that kind of good stuff, and we'll see you next time.